The Great War and the interwar period would see a massive shift in the roles of women and the creation of many new laws. Women in their thousands went to work during the war, and immediately afterwards, those aged 30 or over won the right to vote. However, whilst much progress would be made, there was also setbacks and hardships for women. In the run-up to the 20th century, Victorian feminists had fought hard for education, legal rights, the vote, and the revocation of the Contagious Diseases Act. Parliament seemed on the verge of granting the suffrage's goal of the emancipation of women. However, the start of World War I interrupted what could have been. The Victorian world had seen the emergence of the concept of separate spheres, in which women were deemed to be part of the private sphere, whilst men inhabited the public one. The start of the war saw an entrenchment of this philosophy, and the early war propaganda emphasized it. Women were portrayed as the reason to fight, and as the guardians of the home. Women would also be extolled to be thrifty with food and supplies. The media and propaganda exerted powerful influence on public perception and painted women as being dutiful mothers and wives. The early war years increased the hardship for women, in particular for the working class. Massive unemployment and inflation, plus the stress of absent sons and husbands, made for terrible privations in 1914. Women would have to carry the burden of making ends meet with no work and little money. Flour rose in price by 75%, sugar by 72%, food by 65%, and the cost of living was estimated by the Board of Trade to increase by 81%. Whilst the propaganda painted a picture of women valiantly doing their bit, the reality was much tougher. The war that would be over by Christmas would soon see the government having to offer a lifeline to beleaguered women. With more men being needed at the front and more supplies required for the engines of war, a massive shortage of workers became apparent. The press shifted to promoting women as patriotic workers needed to help our boys at the front. The government created a women's register for work. The register was massively oversubscribed. However, the government failed to find enough positions. 110,000 women had signed up for work, but only 5,000 were initially offered jobs. As the war progressed, women would become involved in more and more job roles. Before the war in 1911, the number of women in the workplace was officially recorded as 29%, with the two main areas of employment being the textile industry, recorded as employing 656,000 workers, and almost 1.5 million in domestic service. With war virtually shutting down the requirement for domestic servants, these women were available for roles vacated by men joining up, or by 1916 being conscripted into the armed forces. Women now found themselves able to work in administrative roles, the civil service, teaching, nursing, the armed forces as police officers, and work in agriculture as land girls. In particular, women were needed to fill the munition factories, massive demands for labour. Many of these new factory workers were aged between 15 and 30 years old. Whilst many women embraced this surge in demand for their labour, it would prove less popular with men. Trade unions were opposed to this move and saw the influx of women as being dangerous. Women were unskilled and also a cheaper source of labour, directly threatening the male workforce. The TUC was particularly upset by women taking men's roles on trains and trams, and lobbied the government in support of protecting men's roles. Women had previously been denied access to many of the jobs that they would now be allowed to undertake, causing much resentment, ticket conductors' roles being a particularly popular position for both male and female workers. The government avoided strike action by conceding to union demands and promised that the male workforce would only be temporarily supplanted as part of the war effort, something that would have a negative impact on women following the end of the war. In industry, and in particular within munition factories, the difficult and complex tasks undertaken by skilled men had prevented the uptake of women. It was via the process of dilution that the tasks were simplified and compartmentalized, releasing the skilled worker and allowing an untrained and crucially lower paid woman to take over. With women pouring into factories, it was estimated that 70 to 80% of the workforce was female. Industrial output was boosted. Lloyd George was soon being praised for solving the munitions crisis that had been deemed to be threatening the war effort. women enjoyed the better pay, social activities and camaraderie that these roles opened up to them. Indeed, at the Woolwich munitions factory, a woman could earn as much as £6 a week, a staggeringly large amount of money for the time. In fact, the average wage of women went from around 13 shillings a week to about 30 over the course of the war. However, whilst the wages improved for women, they were often paid less than the men they replaced. The hours were long, and many a girl would find herself working an 82-hour week. Additionally, the munitions factories were a dangerous place to work. In Queensferry, from 1917 to 1918, there were 12,778 industrial accidents, including chemical burns, eye injuries, and chemical dermatitis. In the Woolwich factory, workers also complained of complications. A survey revealed 36% struggled with depression, 25% had skin irritation, and 37% complained of suffering from pain. There was the constant danger of toxic jaundice, leading to some workers being called a canary girl, a dangerous side effect of working with the chemicals in weapons, notably TNT, resulting in a bright yellow skin condition which could prove lethal. With the munition worker being a key element of the war effort, working conditions did improve, but accidents were still an issue. An example of the risks was the 1917 explosion at Silvertown, which killed 73 and injured around 400 people. Under the Defence of the Realm Act, many incidents were covered up. With women, and in particular young girls in the workplace, moral concerns loomed. A form of moral panic set in. Authorities became concerned by their drinking habits, morals, and corruption of these newly liberated ladies. Once more, women were threatened with a return to unfair judgment, leading to feminists being alarmed that the Contagious Diseases Act was in danger of being re-implemented under a new guise. Female police patrols scoured the borders of factories and barracks looking for immoral women, and the public started to become concerned over the corruption of society. Men, it seemed, were ready to be saucy, and women, it was assumed, indulged them. Alarm spread that there was an increase in illegitimacy and divorce. War, it seemed, was causing a collapse in social order. Statistics showed that this was in fact a false alarm. Sylvia Pankhurst, looking back, commented on this time, stating that wartime hysterics gave currency to fabulous rumour. A commission in 1918 concluded that we can find no justification of any kind for the vague accusations of women's conduct. However, during the war, the fear was that there was a risk to soldiers from ladies suffering from khaki fever. With the economic issues of 1914, the moral doubts of society, and the hostile acceptance of women in the workplace, the Great War was not the golden era it has sometimes been portrayed. It did, however, see many women taking on challenging roles, experience higher wages, and prove that a woman could indeed do the work of a man. Women would emerge from the war with a newfound confidence. They had entered the public sphere and would fight to earn a platform in the conservative backlash of the interwar period. In 1918, with the war ended and Europe once more at peace, it was assumed that women would accept that they should return to the pre-war status quo. Many women welcomed this, as the dual burden of managing home and work was onerous. However, for others it was a bitter pill to swallow. Government policy sought to enforce a return to normality. The woman's place was deemed most firmly at home as a mother and wife. The men returning from the front expected to return to civilian life as workers. Women's voices were mostly ignored, and thousands of women were forced out of the jobs they had acquired during the war. The civil service saw a slight rise in women's numbers, but nowhere near the peak of the war. In 1914 there had been 66,000 employed. During the war this rose to 235,000, but by 1928 it had fallen back to around 74,000. The munitions workers were dismissed en masse, leading Lady Rhondda to calculate that unemployment was as high as 1.5 million versus the official figure of 425,000. Women who sought work were steered towards domestic service. By March 1919, the government's policies had reduced official unemployment to 90,000. This was due to many women being forced into service. Later, with the 1931 Anomalies Act, unemployment for women seemingly dropped as the act wiped out the records of married unemployed women. In Wales, 40% of the female workforce was in low-paid roles as domestic servants, frequently leading to young girls moving to London. But this long-range movement of vulnerable girls led to concerns over the rise of white slavery. Women who found other roles often encountered the marriage bar, forcing them to quit their job if they were already married or later got married. In the 1920s, the marriage bar was an act of law and impacted civil servants and teachers very heavily. The interwar years were increasingly framed as a post-feminist world. Women had achieved much in the Victorian era and had won the vote. It was presumed by some that there was no need to fight for women's rights any longer. The period was anti-progressive and reactionary. Regardless of the cost to women or their objections, the mood was that a woman's natural role was to be at home. She should desire to be married with a family. Films and novels reinforced this concept. Society, spurred on by the press attacks, also saw that a woman who refused to give up her job for a man was acting in a willful and perverse way. Writing to the Times in 1923, Lieutenant G. Dickens was outraged that he had lost out on a post with the Royal Astronomical Society. "I ascertained that an unmarried woman had been given a man's job. Surely such an appointment in these times is unjustified." Men who had fought in the war were deemed more deserving of jobs than women. Compounded matters, the world entered the Great Depression, further hindering the lives of women in Britain. There was little state aid, and the introduction of means testing was particularly disliked. The state paid a mere 30 shillings a week for a family with 2 children. With coal and agriculture hit very hard, the plight of Welsh women and their family was desperate. In England, unemployment was 20.6%, in Wales 37.5%, but in some areas it was even higher. For example, Merthyr was a staggering 66%. Families, and in particular women, went hungry, leading to the Hunger March in 1934. Women shouldered the burden the most. Ellie Ginsberg commented that the children are hungry, the men are hungry, but most hungry of all are the women. With the state of women's health frequently being in a precarious position, the added pressure of economic difficulty did not help. Maternal mortality fluctuated between 3.93 and 6.61 per 1,000 births between 1928 and 1935, depending on the region. Wales was consistently worse than England. Indeed, in most locations the death rates fell, whilst in Wales the rates climbed. With health, employment and economic factors causing difficulties, women would also be attacked on the moral front, as they had been during the war. As I've already mentioned, women were assumed to desire marriage. The war had challenged this assumption of marriage, and many women would continue to do so after it. Those women who did not conform created a dangerous or undesirable image in the minds of many. One such type of dangerous woman was the flapper. Typically, she was seen as sexually wanton. They were party-going, wild-dancing, skinny young girls with short hair and short hemlines, a challenge to the conservative morality of the era. The term flapper became an insulting term and was used to demonstrate that young women were too frivolous and should not be granted the vote. Having achieved partial emancipation, it wouldn't be until 1928 that women would finally be given equal rights to men and be allowed to vote from the age of 21. Curiously, the term flapper faded out of use around the same time. Hollywood films also gave rise to the sexually charged image of the vamp. However, films and novels also painted women in a more positive way, often portraying successful young women as working. That is, until they got married, the assumption being that work and marriage were not compatible. This pervasive philosophy led to scorn for spinsters, because they had not conformed to society mores and married, unpatriotically not securing the future of the nation by failing to have children. The press concerned itself with these surplus women. In 1920, Dr. Murray Leslie delivered a lecture to the London Institute of Hygiene, in which he reported his concerns over the issue of increasing numbers of single women. In reaction, the Daily Mail ran several stories bemoaning this perilous situation for society. Women were painted as being desperate for men and exhibiting a lower standard of morality. Jessica Mitford commented that women would have to simply accept entering the twilight state of aunthood. The situation of having too many women after the war had been predicted during the conflict. At an assembly in 1917, the senior mistress of Bournemouth High School for Girls had announced the grim future for her sixth formers. "I have come to tell you a terrible fact. Only 1 out of 10 of you girls can ever hope to marry. This is not a guess of mine. It is a statistical fact. Nearly all the men who might have married you have been killed." For upper and middle class women it was very hard. Society was still reluctant to have marriage out of class. The vast majority of officers were from these classes and had died at a 2-to-1 ratio compared to the non-commissioned men. The 1921 census showed that whilst the population had grown by 4.7% compared to 1911, the number of women in excess of men had increased to close to 2 million. The problem of this disparity in men to women led to several books designed to aid women struggling to cope with this reality. In 1928, The Technique of the Love Affair was published under a pseudonym by Doris Langley Moore. It was a guide to enable women to secure a husband. In 1936, Marjorie Hillis had a book published, Live Alone and Like It, a guide for the extra women. Understanding that women were unlikely to marry, this book instead focused on helping women deal with spinsterhood. Some women, of course, were happy to be able to live alone. Not all women pined for marriage. Circumstances also meant it was now possible for single women to not have to marry. Regardless, society expected women to seek blissful married life and rejected those who did not. Many of these women came under suspicion of being lesbians. Positive attitudes to women tended to come from other women. Feminism did not simply stop during the interwar period. It would fight for women, continuing the spirit of reform from the pre-war era. During the interwar period, many new laws would be brought into force which were crucial to women's rights. The first major law was the Representation of the People Act in 1918, granting votes to women over 30. 1918 also saw the Education Act, which, regardless of circumstance or gender, raised the school leaving age to 14. These acts would be followed by the Eligibility of Women Act, allowing women to stand as MPs. In 1919, the Sex Discrimination Removal Act allegedly removed the barriers to many previously barred jobs, in particular granting women access to the legal profession. In 1923, women could divorce on equal terms with men. In 1925, they had pensions equalised with men and also achieved equality in the guardianship of children. 1927 saw the law allowing children to be granted legitimacy upon marriage. 1928 saw the Representation of the People Equal Franchise Act being passed, finally granting all women over 21 the vote. This act added around 5 million women to the electoral pool and saw equal suffrage finally being achieved. In spite of the many difficult times women would endure, these barrage of laws placed them in good stead for the future and did much to resolve long-term injustices that feminists had fought for. Between 1914 and 1939, whilst the feminist cause had made much progress, little had actually changed in the day-to-day lives of women, in particular those from the working class. The war years had shown what women could do when given the chance, and gave them a sense of achievement and self-belief. The post-war era saw a backlash and in many ways repressed women. However, it also saw many new acts brought into law and enabled the women's movement to move forward in a more progressive direction. Women finally had the vote and more protection in law. It would be a tough time for women between the wars, but feminism would move the agenda on, and following the Second World War, women would finally start to benefit from the campaigns of the various feminist movements prior to 1945. Equality was slowly edging towards reality, a feminist issue that still rumbles on into the 21st century.